In June of 1941, the largest invasion in human history thundered eastward across the plains of Europe. Operation Barbarossa, a gamble of men, steel, and ideology, sought not only to conquer territory, but to erase an empire. The world watched as the German Wehrmacht surged toward the Soviet heartland, its advance swift, merciless, seemingly unstoppable. For months, the outcome hung in balance. Had events taken a different course, the century itself might have been rewritten. This is the hidden story of the war that almost was, a Europe consumed by shadows of triumph and ruin. In the cold autumn of 1941, the German war machine advanced deeper into the Soviet Union than even its own generals had believed possible. Army Group Center, led by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, launched Operation Typhoon, the Great Offensive, designed to seize Moscow before winter. In our history, the Wehrmacht faltered before the capital, bogged down by mud, snow, and stiffening Soviet resistance. But in this alternate record, pieced together from declassified staff papers and suppressed intelligence briefings, the Germans succeeded. The key lay not in brute force, but in a ruthless decision to bypass prolonged frontal assaults and execute a massive encirclement maneuver. The double pincer began in late October, with the 3rd Panzer Army under Hermann Hoth striking from the WWII north near Kalinin, while Heinz Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army drove in from the south around Tula. Soviet forces, exhausted from weeks of retreat, were caught in the jaws of a mechanized trap. The Red Army's reserve front, commanded by General Zhukov, found its flanks collapsing faster than reinforcements could arrive. The famous order, "Not one step back," had yet to be declared, and Soviet divisions disintegrated in the fields and forests west of Moscow. By mid-November, over 500,000 troops were encircled, their lines of retreat severed. Supplies dwindled to nothing, and with no winter clothing issued, men froze in trenches while German panzer columns cut rail and road arteries with precision. On December 2nd, after days of house-to-house combat, German troops raised the swastika over the Kremlin. Reports describe SS propaganda units rushing film crews into Red Square, while Goebbels' ministry prepared the announcement that the Bolshevik capital has fallen. The immediate effect was devastating. Soviet communications fractured, the Stavka command network splintered, and Joseph Stalin disappeared from public broadcast. For 3 weeks, the world speculated whether he had been killed or fled eastward. Only later would it be confirmed that the Soviet leader had evacuated by special train to Kuibyshev, leaving Moscow's fate sealed. In London, Churchill's war cabinet convened emergency sessions. Intelligence officers reported that the Soviet state might collapse within months. Some ministers argued Britain could no longer rely on the USSR to bear the brunt of German manpower. In Washington, President Roosevelt received a grim dossier from the Office of Strategic Services. Without Moscow, the Red Army faces dissolution. German domination of the Eurasian heartland is imminent. The prospect of a Europe united under Nazi hegemony, stretching from the Atlantic to the Urals, now seemed possible. Yet the fall of Moscow was not the final blow Berlin imagined. Soviet resistance, though decapitated, did not vanish. Entire armies retreated east, reorganizing along the Volga. Industry, already evacuated to the Urals in desperate convoys, continued to function. Factories in Magnitogorsk and Sverdlovsk turned out tanks and artillery by the thousands. The NKVD orchestrated partisan networks behind German lines, disrupting supply chains. While the Wehrmacht held Moscow, it soon found itself defending a prize it could barely afford. The city became a logistical nightmare. Destroyed infrastructure, shortages of coal and food, and endless partisan raids. Holding Moscow required diverting men and resources that Germany could scarcely spare, as the Eastern Front stretched thousands of kilometers. Nevertheless, in the winter of 1941–42, Germany celebrated its greatest triumph. Hitler declared that the Soviet Union is finished. Axis allies, Hungary, Romania, and Italy, sent more divisions to secure the vast occupied territories. Japan, reassessing its strategy in Asia, now considered striking north against the weakened USSR. Neutral states such as Spain and Turkey began to flirt more openly with Berlin. German High Command prepared plans for Operation Blau, aimed at cutting off the Caucasus entirely and seizing the oil fields at Baku, confident that Soviet collapse was only a matter of time. But the long-term consequences were more complex. The Red Army, though battered, did not cease to exist. In this alternate reality, its center of gravity shifted eastward, creating what historians later called the Volga State. From cities like Kuibyshev and Gorky, a shadow capital coordinated resistance. The Soviet people, humiliated by the loss of Moscow, were driven into even greater bitterness. Thousands volunteered for partisan warfare, exacting a bloody toll on German occupation forces. Entire forests became battle zones, where supply convoys were ambushed and railways torn up under cover of night. For the Western Allies, Moscow's fall brought strategic dilemmas. Lend-Lease convoys continued, but doubts grew about their effectiveness. American policymakers feared that billions in aid might be feeding a corpse. British intelligence considered the possibility of negotiating with Germany should the Soviet Union disintegrate. Though never admitted publicly, cabinet papers revealed Churchill ordered contingency studies, codenamed Evergreen, exploring how to preserve Britain's empire if Russia collapsed. The war in Europe thus entered a new, uncertain phase. German troops held the heart of Russia, but their grip was tenuous. Soviet industry and manpower endured, though displaced. And in the shadows, Stalin plotted a return, determined that Moscow's fall would not mean the Soviet Union's death. What had seemed like a swift victory threatened instead to become a drawn-out war of attrition, stretching German resources to the breaking point. The capture of Moscow changed the face of World War II. It shook Allied confidence, emboldened Axis, allies, and convinced millions that Nazi dominance of Europe was inevitable. But it also sowed the seeds of Germany's eventual overstretch. For while the Reich claimed Moscow as its greatest trophy, it had also seized a city it could not truly control, and awakened a Soviet resistance that would fight on from the shadows of the East. The course of the war and the fate of the 20th century would never be the same. In the summer of 1941, Tokyo's Imperial General Headquarters stood at a strategic crossroads. Historically, Japan had embraced the Southern Advance, a gamble for oil, rubber, and territory in the Pacific, culminating in the attack on Pearl Harbor. But in this alternate trajectory, Japanese planners revisited their long-debated Hokushin-Ron strategy, the northern advance into Siberia. The German blitzkrieg into the Soviet Union convinced Tokyo that the time had come. With Moscow's fate hanging in the balance, the Kwantung Army prepared for an invasion across the Amur. The decision was not made lightly. American sanctions had crippled Japan's oil imports, creating intense pressure for expansion southward into the Dutch East Indies. Yet the promise of an alliance with Berlin and the apparent collapse of Soviet defenses altered the calculus. In October 1941, intelligence intercepted from German diplomats in Tokyo revealed secret discussions. If Japan struck the Soviet Far East, Germany would guarantee access to Siberian resources and share captured oil from the Caucasus. In November, under the codename Operation Hokushin, the Imperial General Staff shifted divisions north, massing them along Manchuria's borders. On December 7, 1941, the day that would have lived in infamy for a different reason, Japanese artillery roared not in Hawaii, but along the Amur River. Instead of aircraft descending on Pearl Harbor, waves of Japanese bombers hit Vladivostok, Khabarovsk, and Soviet Pacific air bases. The Red Banner Pacific Fleet, trapped in harbor ice, suffered devastating losses. The Soviet Far Eastern Front, commanded by General Apanasenko, reeled under the surprise assault. Stalin, already grappling with the fall of Moscow, now faced a nightmare scenario, a two-front war stretching from the Baltic to the Pacific. The immediate consequences were catastrophic for the Soviets. The famed Siberian divisions, historically redeployed west to save Moscow, never left the Far East. Instead, they were pinned in brutal defensive actions against the Kwantung Army. Japanese forces captured Blagoveshchensk, severed the Trans-Siberian Railway in multiple sectors, and drove deep toward Chita. Entire convoys of supplies and reinforcements bound for the Western Front were halted or destroyed. Stalin's desperate plan to stabilize the lines around Moscow collapsed without these reinforcements. The Soviet winter counteroffensive of 1941, a decisive turning point in actual history, never materialized. For Japan, the campaign was initially triumphant. Tokyo announced the liberation of Asia from Bolshevism, positioning itself as the eastern spear of the Axis. Berlin celebrated, declaring the Soviet Union's collapse imminent. Yet victory in Siberia brought little in the way of resources. Unlike the oil-rich south, the Siberian front offered frozen tundra, hostile weather, and endless logistical nightmares. Supply lines stretched thin across Manchurian railways, and the Kwantung Army, though formidable on paper, lacked sufficient mechanization for deep operations. Still, the campaign's psychological impact was profound. The Red Army appeared cornered, and Allied leaders feared a total Axis stranglehold. In Washington, Roosevelt's administration was caught off guard. American planners, expecting a Japanese strike southward, had reinforced the Philippines and Hawaii. Instead, Japan's northern attack left US forces untouched. For a time, isolationist voices gained strength, arguing that America had avoided war entirely. But intelligence soon revealed the grim reality. With the USSR fighting for survival, Britain stood alone in Europe. Roosevelt faced mounting pressure. Should the United States intervene against Germany now, or wait until Japan inevitably turned south for resources? The long-term effects of Japan's decision reshaped the global conflict. With Soviet strength fractured, the German Wehrmacht advanced deeper into Russia with less resistance. By mid-1942, the Red Army had lost both its capital and its eastern lifeline. Stalin's government in Kuibyshev teetered, surviving only through brutal mobilization and scorched earth tactics. Partisan warfare flared across occupied zones, but without Western aid and with Japan cutting supply lines through Siberia, the Soviet state verged on collapse. British intelligence circulated a chilling assessment. The Soviet Union may not endure beyond 1942. Yet Japan, despite its victories, soon faced the strategic paradox that had haunted its leadership for decades. The conquest of Siberia brought no oil, no rubber, and no quick victory. Instead, Tokyo inherited a war of attrition across endless frozen steppes. The Imperial Navy, deprived of southern resources, began rationing fuel by late 1942. Industrial output slowed, aircraft production faltered, and naval expansion ground to a halt. Even as Tokyo boasted of Siberian conquests, whispers within the high command warned of economic strangulation. Unlike the southern advance, the Northern War did not solve Japan's resource crisis. It only deepened it. For Germany, however, Japan's northern strike bought precious time. The absence of Siberian reinforcements allowed Army Group Center to consolidate its hold on Moscow, while Army Group South pressed toward the Caucasus. German generals believed they now had the Soviet Union on the brink, but the Reich also began to sense unease. Tokyo's inability to secure vital oil fields meant Berlin still bore the burden of sustaining Axis fuel demands. What had seemed a perfect division of labor, Germany crushing the West, Japan the East, soon revealed itself as a mutual drain. In the post-war decades, historians described this alternate path as the war that starved itself. The Soviet Union, cornered but unbroken, retreated deeper into Asia, sustaining resistance at horrific human cost. Japan, victorious but impoverished, found itself locked in a frozen front that yielded little, and the United States, spared the shock of Pearl Harbor, delayed entry into the war until late 1942, when it finally became clear that Axis victory in Eurasia would threaten the entire balance of power. The world stood on the edge of a darker future. The Northern Strike altered the trajectory of the Second World War. shifting its center of gravity away from the Pacific and firmly into the frozen expanses of Siberia. While the Allies debated intervention and Germany pressed its advantage, millions perished in the bitter struggle for the East. A war of steel, frost, and attrition fought in shadows far from the Western gaze. Classified archives now reveal how close the world came to an Axis-dominated Eurasia, and how a single strategic choice in Tokyo reshaped the fate of the century. By the summer of 1942, the Wehrmacht stood at a crossroads. Having seized Moscow in the previous winter, Hitler and his generals debated the next step. In our history, Operation Blau faltered at Stalingrad, where Soviet resistance and overstretched German supply lines broke the invaders' momentum. But in this alternate path, the German High Command avoided the trap of urban warfare on the Volga. Instead, the full weight of Army Group South drove relentlessly into the Caucasus for Operation Edelweiss. With one clear objective: the oil of Baku. German intelligence knew the stakes. The Reich's armies, air force and navy consumed millions of tons of fuel annually, and without new sources, long-term war was unsustainable. Hitler's directive made the target unmistakable. The possession of the oil fields of the Caucasus is decisive for the continuation of the war. In July 1942, General Ewald von Kleist's 1st Panzer Army surged through Rostov-on-Don, breaking into the North Caucasus with speed and precision. Mountain divisions, assisted by seasoned Gebirgsjäger troops, scaled the passes of the Caucasus. Ranges, unfurling swastikas on peaks that overlooked the oil fields beyond. The Soviets recognized the danger, but the loss of Moscow had already fractured their command structure. Stalin, directing the war effort from Kuibyshev, lacked reserves to halt the German advance. Entire Red Army formations, weakened by attrition, could not contain the mechanized thrust. NKVD demolition squads destroyed wells and pipelines in Baku in a desperate bid to deny fuel to the enemy, but German engineers, assisted by Romanian oil specialists, quickly restored production. By September, Baku fell under German control, its rich fields pumping crude into Axis pipelines and tankers across the Black Sea. The immediate consequences were profound. German armored divisions, once restrained by fuel shortages, found themselves resupplied. Luftwaffe squadrons enjoyed extended operational range, striking deep into Soviet rear areas. Italian and Hungarian allies, dependent on German fuel, grew, emboldened. In Berlin, propaganda declared the lifeblood of Bolshevism now flows to the Reich. Goebbels' ministry released triumphant newsreels of German engineers standing over gushing wells, promising an endless war economy. For the Soviet Union, the loss was catastrophic. Baku had supplied over 70% of Soviet petroleum. Without it, tanks lay idle, aircraft sorties dwindled, and even basic logistics faltered. Trains could not move troops or supplies with sufficient speed. The Red Army, already retreating eastward, slowed to a crawl. Entire divisions froze in the steppe without fuel for transport or heating. American Lend-Lease shipments of gasoline via the Persian corridor increased, but they were insufficient to replace the vast loss. Stalin, in a fury, accused his generals of betrayal, while NKVD officers carried out mass purges of officers suspected of incompetence or disloyalty. Britain reacted with alarm. Middle Eastern Command in Cairo reported fears that German forces, now entrenched in the Caucasus, might press south into Persia. If the Reich seized Abadan and the oil fields of Iran, the British Empire's energy lifeline would be threatened. Churchill called the situation the gravest crisis since Dunkirk. Secret war cabinet discussions explored the unthinkable, a possible withdrawal from the Mediterranean to defend the home islands. American strategists, too, viewed the fall of the Caucasus as a turning point. With Germany in control of both continental resources and the vital oil fields, the balance of power shifted ominously. Yet occupation of the Caucasus came at a price. German supply lines stretched thousands of kilometers, vulnerable to partisan attacks and Soviet counterstrikes. Mountain warfare drained divisions accustomed to the plains of Europe. local populations, far from embracing the Germans as liberators, launched resistance movements. Chechen and Dagestani fighters harassed convoys, forcing the Wehrmacht to dedicate entire battalions to rear area security. Despite these challenges, the resource advantage was undeniable. With oil flowing westward, the Reich's war machine entered 1943 stronger than ever. The broader ripple effects soon emerged. Japan, previously reluctant to antagonize the United States, re-evaluated its strategy. With German fuel resources seemingly secure, Tokyo believed the Axis position unassailable. Instead of waiting, Japan launched campaigns into Southeast Asia months later than in real history, calculating that Allied resistance would wither as Germany tightened its grip on Eurasia. The United States, though not yet attacked directly, recognized the danger. With Axis control over Eurasian resources, global balance shifted toward a world dominated by Berlin and Tokyo. Roosevelt, addressing his advisors, described it as a shadow darker than Versailles, a century of fascist empire. Meanwhile, within the Soviet Union, collapse loomed. Food shortages spread as fuel shortages paralyzed agriculture. Cities east of the Volga swelled with refugees, while factories evacuated to the Urals could not function at full capacity. Partisan warfare became the Soviet Union's lifeline, but it could not compensate for the loss of industrial output. Stalin's government clung to survival, but internal documents reveal even the NKVD considered relocating further east to Novosibirsk or beyond. The specter of state collapse hovered over the USSR. In Berlin, Hitler boasted that the Soviet colossus is shattered, the war is won. Yet history would prove otherwise. The Caucasus oil sustained Germany for years, but it also anchored vast divisions in a hostile region, drawing resources away from other fronts. As the Allies gathered strength in North Africa and prepared for invasions in Europe, Germany's grip on its oil prize became both its greatest strength and its Achilles heel. For while the Reich enjoyed temporary abundance, the war had not ended. It had only grown larger, bloodier, and more uncertain. The capture of Baku in 1942 redefined the Second World War. It crippled Soviet industry, shook Allied confidence, and gave Germany the resource base it had always lacked. But it also locked the Reich into a war of occupation across the Caucasus, stretching its armies ever thinner. Classified reports from both Allied and Axis archives remind us of a haunting truth. Victory in war is not only about what is gained, but what it costs to hold. And in the shadow of the oil fields, the seeds of future ruin were already sown. By early 1943, the European balance of power had shifted dramatically. Moscow lay in German hands, Baku's oil flowed westward, and Japan had pressed north into Siberia. The Soviet Union, battered and fractured, survived only in exile beyond the Volga. London and Washington faced a grim question. Could Stalin's regime endure, or was the Soviet colossus truly collapsing? Behind the thunder of official speeches and propaganda, secret memoranda reveal a darker undercurrent, the possibility of peace with Hitler. British archives, long suppressed and declassified only in fragments, speak of Operation Evergreen, a contingency explored by Churchill's war cabinet. Though Churchill himself famously vowed to fight until the end, his advisors recognized that Britain's position was precarious. The Soviets, once the shield on the Eastern Front, now teetered. American entry into the war was hesitant, with Congress wary of sending young men into another European bloodbath, while Japan remained focused in Asia. For a fleeting moment in 1943, British officials feared they might once again stand alone against a continent dominated by Germany. Evergreen began with discreet channels. Swedish diplomats in Stockholm, Spanish officials in Madrid, and neutral envoys in Switzerland were all approached to test the waters of a possible settlement. The outlines were chilling. Britain would retain its empire and naval supremacy, while Germany would dominate continental Europe. France, already under occupation, would remain a vassal. Eastern Europe and Russia would be left under German control, creating a natural order across Eurasia. Churchill officially dismissed these ideas in cabinet, but the mere fact that they were debated underscores how fragile Allied unity had become. In Berlin, Hitler's Foreign Office received whispers of these overtures with interest. Ribbentrop drafted preliminary conditions. Britain must end bombing raids, recognize German dominance of Europe, and reopen trade. Hitler, intoxicated by victories in Moscow and the Caucasus, believed Britain might yet see reason. Goebbels privately noted in his diary that the English are tired, they wish only to preserve their colonies. The propaganda ministry prepared talking points for a potential Anglo-German understanding, a pact that would allow the Reich to consolidate its continental empire while avoiding further bloodshed in the West. Meanwhile, in Washington, Roosevelt was briefed on the disturbing possibility. OSS reports from Bern indicated that British diplomats were making low-volume inquiries about peace conditions. Roosevelt reacted with fury, warning Churchill in a personal message that any separate deal would fracture the Atlantic Alliance. In private, American generals admitted their fears. Without a Soviet front, an Allied invasion of Europe would be nearly impossible. A negotiated peace, however limited, would leave the United States confronting a German empire of unprecedented scale. The moral dimension weighed heavily on London. Could Britain, the last free state in Western Europe, negotiate with a regime that had enslaved half the continent? Publicly, the government maintained its defiance, but cabinet minutes from May 1943 record chillingly pragmatic exchanges. One minister asked, "If Russia collapses and America does not land, are we to bleed ourselves dry until nothing remains?" The silence that followed, historians note, speaks volumes. Even Churchill, defiant in rhetoric, privately acknowledged the spectre of isolation. For Germany, the prospect of a Western peace offered immense strategic relief. With Britain neutralized, the Reich could focus entirely on the East. Plans were drawn up for massive resettlement of conquered Soviet territories under AMG, General Plan Ost, a demographic reordering of Europe that envisioned German colonists spreading across the steppes. Armaments Minister Albert Speer drafted production schedules, assuming a Europe no longer under constant bombing, where factories could operate without interruption. Luftwaffe leaders speculated that with the RAF grounded, resources could be redirected entirely to the Eastern Front. The dream of a thousand-year Reich seemed closer than ever, but the peace never came. Churchill, despite mounting pressure, ultimately rejected Evergreen. He feared the long-term consequences of a German-dominated Europe and trusted that American resolve would harden. Roosevelt redoubled his commitment, accelerating preparations for the invasion of North Africa and planning the eventual liberation of Europe. Still, the fact that such discussions occurred in secret chambers under the cover of national survival reveals a dangerous fragility in the Allied coalition. The ripple effects of these hidden debates extended into the post-war imagination. Soviet intelligence, always suspicious of its Western partners, intercepted fragments of evergreen discussions through agents in Stockholm. Stalin, already distrustful after the loss of Moscow, never forgave what he perceived as British betrayal. Even as Lend-Lease convoys struggled across Arctic waters, he viewed his allies with suspicion, convinced they might abandon him to make their own deal with Hitler. The seeds of Cold War hostility, some historians argue, were planted not in 1945, but in these shadowy talks of 1943. In retrospect, Operation Evergreen remains one of the most haunting what-ifs of the war. Had Britain agreed to negotiate, the face of the 20th century would have been transformed. Germany, unchallenged in Europe, could have focused its full might on crushing the Soviet Union. The United States, isolated across the Atlantic, would have confronted a Eurasian empire spanning from the Atlantic coast to the Urals, from the Arctic to the Black Sea. And millions more might have perished under Nazi dominion, their fates sealed by a handshake across the negotiating table. Western betrayal never materialized, but its shadow lingers. In the dim corridors of Whitehall, where papers marked most secret gathered dust, the outlines of a possible peace remain etched as a reminder of how thin the line of defiance truly was. In public, Churchill thundered that Britain would never yield. In private, his ministers dared to ask, if the Soviets fell, would Britain still have the strength to stand alone? The question was never answered, but its very asking reveals how close the world came to a negotiated end, not of peace, but of freedom itself. When Moscow fell and the Caucasus slipped into German hands, the world presumed the Soviet Union would collapse. Berlin declared the Bolshevik menace finished, London weighed peace, and Washington debated intervention. Yet hidden deep beyond the Urals, a different war began. A shadow war that few outside the Soviet state ever fully understood. In the cold, sprawling cities of Novosibirsk, Sverdlovsk, and Kuibyshev, the remnants of Stalin's government reconstituted themselves into what Allied intelligence would later describe as the Phantom Capital. The relocation was not improvised. As early as October 1941, the Soviet State Defense Committee had drafted on Directive 6210, a contingency plan for governing from Siberia should Moscow fall. When the capital was encircled, Stalin, Beria, and key members of the Politburo boarded armored trains and headed east under NKVD guard. Entire ministries followed, their files stuffed into suitcases, their staff huddled in freezing wagons. By the time German divisions occupied the Kremlin, the Soviet Union had already moved its beating heart to Novosibirsk. There, in secretive halls guarded by special troops, the new shadow capital began issuing orders. The immediate task was survival. Industrial relocation, begun even before Barbarossa, now accelerated at breakneck pace. Factories dismantled in Leningrad, Kharkov, and Moscow arrived in the Urals aboard endless trains, reassembled by engineers under brutal conditions. Aircraft plants in Sverdlovsk churned out Yak fighters. Tank factories in Chelyabinsk, nicknamed Tankograd, produced T-34s by the hundreds. The Trans-Siberian Railway became the artery of the new Soviet war machine, stretching across thousands of kilometers, a fragile lifeline that German and Japanese forces sought constantly to sever. Militarily, the Soviet strategy shifted to attrition. With conventional armies shattered, Stavka authorized the creation of guerrilla commands under NKVD oversight. Partisan brigades, supplied by parachute drops from Siberia, operated across occupied Russia. They blew up railways, ambushed convoys, and assassinated collaborationist officials. German reports from Army Group Center complained that no road, no village, no supply line is safe at night. For every village pacified, another rose in rebellion. The war in Russia became less about sweeping offensives and more about endless skirmishes, a bleeding wound the Wehrmacht could never close. For the civilians left behind, the shadow war was brutal beyond imagination. German reprisals were swift and merciless. Entire villages burned for partisan activity. Yet the NKVD's hand was heavy too. Secret orders from Beria mandated executions of suspected collaborators, ensuring that fear governed as effectively as ideology. In the archives of Novosibirsk, grim reports survive of mass deportations, forced labor camps, and desperate attempts to maintain order among millions of displaced citizens. This was a Soviet Union surviving not by strength, but by iron discipline and ruthless control. Internationally, the existence of the phantom government became both a rallying cry and a point of suspicion. British intelligence debated whether Stalin's regime still held legitimacy. American analysts worried that aid delivered through the Persian corridor might never reach frontline units. Yet OSS agents, working with partisan couriers, confirmed that weapons stamped "Made in USA" were appearing in ambushes west of Smolensk. The shadow state, despite its exile, remained connected to the fight. Roosevelt described it privately as a government without a capital, but not without teeth. For Germany, the persistence of Soviet resistance was maddening. Holding Moscow and Baku had been heralded as decisive victories, yet the Red Army refused to die. Wehrmacht generals warned Hitler that the occupation was draining resources at unsustainable rates. The Eastern Front became a war of attrition without end, a vast landscape where victory could be declared on maps, but never truly secured. Behind every captured city lay another hidden factory, another guerrilla cell, another partisan ambush. The Reich's dream of a swift annihilation gave way to the nightmare of endless occupation. Japan, too, discovered the limits of conquest. Its northern strike into Siberia captured territory but could not crush Soviet resilience. Partisan warfare spread into the taiga, where Japanese garrisons froze in makeshift outposts. Supply lines from Manchuria stretched thin, harassed by Soviet raiders who melted into forests and mountains. The Shadow War consumed men and materiel faster than Tokyo could afford, leaving the Japanese economy strained and its army bogged down in a frozen quagmire. The conquest of Siberia brought no oil, no grain, no quick victory, only bleeding attrition. Within the Siberian capital, Stalin ruled with characteristic paranoia. Surrounded by NKVD guards, he issued endless decrees to sustain the illusion of central control. Propaganda broadcasts from Novosibirsk insisted that the Soviet Union lives and fights, even as millions starved and froze. Politburo minutes reveal bitter disputes. Some argued for concentrating entirely on partisan war. Others urged regrouping for one last great counteroffensive. Stalin himself oscillated, at times demanding all-out attacks, at others ordering retreats into the depths of Asia. His iron will kept the regime intact, but it was a government living on borrowed time. And yet, for all its fragility, the Shadow War achieved its goal: survival. By denying Germany total victory, by keeping the Soviet flag flying, even in exile, Stalin ensured that the USSR remained in the war. This endurance forced Britain and America to continue their commitment. Lend-Lease convoys pushed across Persia, aircraft were ferried through Alaska into Siberia, and Allied propaganda framed the Soviet Union as battered but unbroken. The war remained global. The Axis denied its chance at consolidating Eurasia unchallenged. In the long term, the Shadow War reshaped the post-war order. Soviet survival, even in exile, guaranteed that any Allied victory would leave Moscow with a claim to legitimacy. Yet the memory of Britain's flirtation with peace and America's hesitation bred deep mistrust. Stalin never forgave his allies, convinced that they had been ready to abandon him. The Cold War that followed was born not just of ideological difference but of betrayal, real or imagined, in those dark years when the USSR fought from the shadows. The Siberian exile remains one of history's great untold chapters. Official histories spoke of battles in Stalingrad or Kursk. But in this altered reality, the true war was fought far from headlines. In forests, mountains, and secret factories where a state without a capital clung to survival. The Shadow. Government in Novosibirsk was not glamorous nor victorious, but it was unyielding. It embodied the Soviet principle that so long as one factory produced tanks, one partisan fired a rifle, and one flag bore the hammer and sickle, the Union still lived. And in that endurance lay the faint hope that Hitler's empire, vast and triumphant, might one day fall. History records that the tide turned, that the Soviet Union endured, and that Berlin eventually fell. Yet in the dust of suppressed archives lies another possibility, one where victory came to the invaders, and the map of the world was drawn in darker lines. These corridors of forgotten history remind us how fragile survival was, how narrow the path between despair and deliverance. Operation Barbarossa was not merely a battle for land, but for the future itself. And in its alternate ending, we glimpse the world we narrowly escaped,